I'm wondering if you can see my screen.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. So I'm going to go to presentation mode. All right. Right. So there are a lot of things happening here at the same time. So I'll start with an explanation of the title, which is a paraphrase of the title of an episode from the series Star Trek Enterprise. And the episode was called In a Mirror Darkly. And in this episode, they're crossing over to a dark mirror universe, which is a bit of a trope in the Star Trek series. It came back in the current Discovery series at some point. And this kind of episode obviously deals with the anxiety surrounding the shadow. In Jungian terms, the dark part of the self, the confrontation with the unwanted part of the self, meeting one's doppelganger and getting the sense of living another life, and going to another space. And of course, here I'm referring to Foucault's essay of Other Spaces, which unfortunately is very short, but attempted to define and classify heterotopias, which he says that are spaces in which all the other real sites can be found, mirrored, represented, contested, and inverted. And obviously this has been incredibly influential and as a work, but at the same time, I think there's some problems with it. For example, he prefaces his classification of spaces with a note on the work of Gaston Bachelard and other phenomenologists who have taught us that we do not live in a homogeneous or empty space, but on the contrary, in a space thoroughly imbued with quantities and perhaps phantasmatic as well, in Foucault's words. And however, he concludes that while these analyses are fundamental for reflection in our time, they primarily concern internal space. And Foucault declared that he was interested, in fact, in external spaces. And this is actually what I'm going to question. Whether the heterotopias he defines as real spaces, which exist outside of all places and which are absolutely different from all the sites they reflect and speak about, can be considered unambiguously external. For example, there are certain external spaces like libraries and museums which occupy physical spaces and which house collections of physical artifacts, but they also function as loci of cultural preservation and memory, conserving not only the products of a particular era and location, but also ideally its spirit and worldview. And there are also cases where no physical relics of a culture exist to be placed in the external space of a museum. So the culture can continue to exist within those who have experienced it, becoming, of course, more diluted with every generation as experience is replaced with its reconstructions. Or in the case of oral cultures, which produce few physical artifacts of importance, the culture lives exclusively within its members, so that its museums are in fact housed in human minds. And in a grimmer example, concentration camps begin as external spaces for their prisoners, but in time, the relationship between inhabitant and inhabited space becomes ambiguous and even reversed. While at first the prisoners are the inhabitants and the concentration camp the inhabited space, after a while, the concentration camp starts inhabiting the prisoners. So even after the physical external space of a concentration camp is destroyed and perhaps replaced so that no trace is left, it continues to live in its form of prisoners, a dark space of fear, torment, and hopelessness. So it is possible that other spaces exist internally as well, as psychological representations of physical worlds, as hells or heavens, or as mysterious spaces which are the exclusive domain of the imagination. After all, and when he says places of this kind are outside of all places, it's hard not to think that about what is more outside of all places than the mind. The mind is a bastion, an impenetrable space which cannot really be shared. Now, I'd like to explain why Ursula K Le Guin, especially because Le Guin is someone who has very much contested the conventions of the fantasy genre, who introduced characters of color at a time when this was rather unacceptable in the late 60s, female protagonists, and who draws her inspiration from non-Western sources such as Taoist philosophy and Native American folklore. But at the same time, as someone who comes from very much a Western literary scholarly background, someone who studied Romance languages and medieval French poetry, she can never escape her background. And so we have numerous references to classical literature and classical mythology in both her early and her late works. So her earlier works, like the Earthsea series, which is probably one of her best known works, along with some of her science fiction novels. But also her second fantasy series called Annals of the Western Shore, and her very last novel, Lavinia, which is a prose. It's not really a translation. It's a very creative translation, an adaptation of the last 6 books of Virgil's Aeneid, and which is I would say a treat for narratologists in particular, because she begins with one line in the Aeneid, which develops into this entire novel, in which Lavinia never loses track of the fact that she is a textual construct rather than a character. So she, as much as she tried to distance herself, I think, from her background, she comes back to it towards the end of her writing career and her life. And this is rather interesting because one of the heterotopic spaces in the Earthsea universe is this other world, afterworld, which is a representation and inversion of the so-called real world of Earthsea, and which is very heavily influenced by Homer, Dante, Rilke, and Eliot, actually following a chain of influence. And this place is very much aberrant in the Earthsea universe. It is a world of undeath, but it is also anomalous in a literary construct which is built on Taoist principles. It very much sticks out. And I think it showcases Le Guin's interest at the time in distancing herself from the supremacy of the Western canon. But then there's this other place in the second novel in the Earthsea series, the Tombs of Atuan, which is what I'll be talking about today. This labyrinth, which is also a heterotopic space, and which exists on so many levels. It has organic qualities in that it functions very much like a digestive system, a brain, and a womb at the same time. It functions as a prison, as a tomb, but also as a mindscape, as the representation of Tenar's psyche, her first female protagonist, which makes her quite relevant. So this novel, The Tombs of Atuan, was published in 1971. And it begins a complicated discussion, I suppose, about Le Guin's relationship with female protagonists. Because in Tenar, which is a recurring character in the Earthsea series, according to some critics, she created the finest and most complicated multiple character in the series, and perhaps in all of her fiction, which is not a small thing to say. So in this novel, in the second novel, the narrative focus shifts to a different corner of the archipelago of Earthsea, the Kargish Isles, and we learn that Arha, the priestess of the Old Ones, these undefined old gods, has died, and that a replacement has been found. A young girl who will be taken from her family, stripped of her own identity, and raised to become the new Arha, the devoured one. And so Tenar, the little girl's life at the temple, thus unfolds in a very predictable manner until an unexpected arrival, when the initial protagonist of the series, the Archmage Ged, enters the labyrinth looking for an artifact, which has political influence. It's not really a magic artifact. It's something which will have a considerable political importance for the world of Earthsea. And he finds himself trapped in the labyrinth. And Tenar, who is herself imprisoned in a life not her own, is faced with a choice: kill him or guide him to freedom. So awakened out of the dust of the tombs, she chooses life, Eros in the broadest sense, over Thanatos, and accompanies him to Gaunt, where she begins a life of her own choosing. But in between these moments, of course, there's a time that is spent in the labyrinth, and that's what I'll mostly focus on. This dark, suffocating place, which is, I suppose, the reason for the pictures that I chose, which are quite depressing. So this place where Tenar is taken to be initiated into becoming Arha is part of a temple complex, which consists of several temples, and has a part of it is above the ground, most of it is underground. And the labyrinth, whose convolutions Tenar will start learning once she comes of age, is a natural cave system enhanced by man-made tunnels, trapdoors, and rooms, such as the painted room and the treasure room, which is where she will eventually lead Ged. It is by far the most symbolically complicated area of the complex, a heterotopic space which exists far outside of Earthsea's all other spaces, and which fulfills all these multiple functions in the life, death, rebirth cycle. And in psychological terms, as an inner space, it signifies the unconscious and remoteness from the wellspring of life. In mythical terms, the labyrinth is associated with seeking, movement, and danger. However, and so it stands in contrast to the primal cave image, which we associate with security, peace, and refuge. However, the labyrinth harbors the possibility of advancing rather than returning into unconsciousness and timelessness. It is a way, if still a confused way, into awareness. And indeed, it is in the labyrinth that Tenar awakens, where she recovers her lost identity and makes choices which will lead her away from the darkness of her stifled existence and into the light and air of the world. Now, her induction into the temple begins with a ritual of devouring, also known as the remaking of the priestess, whose objective is to remake Tenar into Arha, thus stripping her of her name and prior identity, and to create a new priestess in order to replace the dead one. Of course, it is all a hoax, because the new priestess is never really a reincarnation of the old one. And Tenar realizes this as she grows up, and realizes that she cannot remember anything from the lives of the previous priestesses. So rather than establishing a female genealogy, this ritual implies that there's always only one princess. All the other girls and women are thus subsumed into this communal Arha identity, which is the servant, nameless, erased. And this ritual, which it consists of a pantomimed execution, a symbolic butchering of the child's body, And it has a lot of similarities with a banquet, really. That after she's found acceptable by the gods, her body is prepared. Really, there's a salt placed upon her tongue. Her hair is washed with oil and scented vinegar, which instead of reminding us of washing a body with oil and spices, which is something which is done usually for a dead body anyway, it also sounds like the dressing or the marinating of a body. And she's presented to the gods like a feast. And so she undergoes her first death and rebirth. And as Arha, she will live most of her life in the bowels of the complex, roaming the intestinal tract of the labyrinth. So what is taken away from her is her family, her memories, her girlhood, and her future, her potential, and her choice of numerous possible futures. Let them accept her life and the years of her life until her death, the priestesses sing, giving away something which is not in fact theirs to give. And the fact that Tenar's name is also taken away is particularly significant in the context of Earthsea's magic, even though the latter is not practiced in the Kargish Islands. Since magic is a speech act performed via the language of the making, the word or the rune is the deed. To speak or write is to act. So to speak someone's name is to have power of life and death over that person. And so by renouncing her true name and adopting the generic one of the priestess, Arha, along with the passive, the Eaten one, Tenar hands her gods all her agency and power. She says, I'm not Tenar anymore. And the other priestess who trains her says, no, now you're the little one, the Eaten one. And from now on, she's held in a prison, both literally and metaphorically. Her upbringing over the next 15 years is formal and strict, governed by rituals and rules which leave very little room for privacy and introspection. And of course, her education is very much lacking. Most of the time, she finds herself with nothing to do. And her environment is also sterile and stagnant, as she is surrounded mostly by celibate old priestesses and eunuchs. And in time, she grows increasingly alienated from her past and former identity. She forgets her mother. She forgets the few years of childhood she had, and in the end, it was all eaten. However, when she turns 15, she's introduced to the Undertomb and the Labyrinth, which are to become her own domain. And for her, the Labyrinth is a dark, convoluted, unknown, unexplored place to which others have very little access or no access at all. And it's a reflection of her own rather undeveloped, atrophied psyche, which she gradually explores throughout the novel. And it's also the setting of an unexpected encounter, which will prompt a second violent, unscripted death and rebirth. But for the time...
Excuse me, just 5 more minutes to make...
Okay. Okay, that's a really bad... I didn't realize it was going so slowly. Right. Well, it's in the labyrinth that she starts experimented with both godhood and humanity. She discovers that she has the power to condemn others to death because she has the power over people, but not the power to do anything. And when she meets Ged unexpectedly in the labyrinth, she has a choice to kill him or to save him. And initially, she considers killing him. And this is why, very briefly, I thought that she actually experiments with 3 different roles. That inside this labyrinth, she is the Minotaur. The one thing that he needs to be afraid of much more than the gods. But also, I feel that they bounce the roles of Theseus and Ariadne between them. In that both of them are leading, each of them is leading the other one out. she's leading him out of the physical labyrinth, and he is leading her out of this sterile and stagnant kind of life. And it's, of course, there's a sense of elopement at the end as well. So as we kind of see the myth unfolding, and it all culminates in the destruction of this labyrinth. So, of course, because I'm immersed very much in this text and in this concept of other spaces, it was difficult for me not to think about the way it applies to our current situation, because virtual heterotopias have actually been theorized quite early. Cyberspace, digital networks, online encyclopedias and libraries, social media spaces, and now we're dealing with these virtual learning environments, which I think are very much heterotopic because they bring together a number of real sites, like the library and the classroom, and all these spaces for innovation and discovery. Why not? On the plus side, but also perhaps some darker spaces, and prison, I think the prison is actually one of them. Because while depending on the resources we have at our disposal and the training we have with these virtual learning environments and our ability to navigate these labyrinths, we can have heterotopias of perfect order or heterotopias of chaos. But both of these can be oppressive in their own ways. And sometimes in the attempt to offer guidance, some probably go too far and it turns into coercion. Instead of feeling like a place of education, it starts feeling like a prison. And also there is a sense of a panopticon because universities choose learning platforms for everyone to use where they monitor what you're doing, much more so than when we're teaching in a real classroom. And we can monitor what our students are doing, and the students can monitor each other and us to an extent. And there's this sense of everyone watching everyone else, sometimes to make sure that everything is done correctly, other times because it gives them a sense of power. So my question, both for myself and for you as well, and the question to which I don't have an answer, is what role exactly do we play? Are we Ariadne or a psychopomp animal? Are we Karen, basically bringing their lost souls to an afterworld? Are we prison guards, or are we the Minotaur, lurking, waiting for its sacrifices? And I guess coming back to the title of the Star Trek episode, as we step through the mirror into this virtual space, it's difficult not to harbor anxieties over what we find there, because I think everyone is a little different in an online environment. So that's where we find our double, our other, the shadow, that unacceptable part of the self, who can turn out to be an animal or concentration camp guard or monster, even in the worst case scenario. So how are we to navigate this labyrinth so we can be more like Tenar, to actually make our way through the labyrinth to a bright place, to follow a desire to explore and discover, and also find in ourselves a willingness to abandon old identities and embrace new ones. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry if I went over.
Thank you very, very much for really a very nice paper. We have some very short time for a quick question, and then we can complete it over the lunch break, perhaps.
Yes, if I may.
Yes, sure.
Yes. Thank you, Gabriela, for a talk that, as I came to realize, does look a bit like what I'm going to do in a few minutes, but from a different perspective. You have ended your talk with posing a question, and you added to that, I'm not going to answer the question myself. And then you started more or less answering the question by comparing the attitude of students or ourselves in the virtual world to Tenar. Looking at these roles that you presented on slide number 14, is there not one that you would like to advocate? Is there not one that you would like to defend or present us as the most likely one?
I think those of us, at least, who are trying to do good, of course, would like to be more like Ariadne, or like the psychopomp animal, but in a less morbid context, of course. But I think everyone starts in a good place and then finds themselves sucked perhaps into a number of other directions. And I know I've heard stories about classrooms where all students are muted, which in the university context, and in general, I find ridiculous, because, you know, you want interaction and you want them talking and thinking and learning actively. I've heard about professors who will not allow students into their classroom if they're not on camera. Yeah. So what happens, you know, I can't turn on my camera because my laptop broke. It's at the shop and I'm using a different computer. I don't have a camera. What if you hadn't let me come here today? You know, the kind of behavior obviously is deviating in what I consider prison guard behavior. And I know some of our students are Moldovan, actually, because, well, ours is a cross-border faculty. We teach Moldovan students. They usually attend 2 universities. They're stuck in front of the computer from 8 in the morning till 6 at night. It's starting to feel like prison for them.
Yes, true, it does. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. Also, the gender question was quite interesting and struck me about why you chose the Tenar figure and how that could contribute to our discussion about classics and innovation, and what does Tenar can teach us.
Well, and I'm thinking that Ursula Le Guin learned a lot from producing Tenar. She refers to her as a heroine, which is not quite acceptable, I think, anymore. But she says that, at least in her imagination at the time, heroines did not have the freedom to do everything they wanted, unlike heroes. But that's something she changed her mind over time. In the early 90s, she wrote an essay called Earthsea Revisited, in which she discussed her engagement with feminist theory. In particular, she's being judged for being too feminist or not feminist enough. She struggled at the beginning because she was a woman masquerading as a male writer almost, publishing under the name UK Le Guin. Venturing into a space which was mostly a masculine space, science fiction and fantasy, very much dominated by, of course, by Tolkien fantasy, and Tolkien's imitators were quite successful. And I think that in a way, her Tenar's journey reflects her own, that she had to break out of something in order to become one of the most celebrated fantasy and science fiction writers, and also the most literary, I think. I know these genres are not taken seriously, but she really is a very serious and complex writer.
Thank you very much. And we'll move on to our third and last